When I was a little boy, my father was a gardener. He was a very good gardener. We had about 2 acres of land, probably about a third of that he would use as a garden every year. And we had a plow that was a very unique plow. I've never seen one anywhere except at our house when I was growing up. It had a tractor tire, single tractor tire in the back, had like a lawnmower wheel on the front and a plow in the middle, and handlebars running back to where you would stand behind it. So you had to hold it up like a bicycle, and had a Bridges Stratton, however you say that, engine on the top, pull cord, you crank it up, and it was belt driven or chain driven, I think it was, and you could plow your garden with that thing. Well, as just a little bitty fellow, my father would get out to turn the garden or whatever. He had different plows that he could put on there. Middle Buster is one of them that he called. He called this thing a mule. I don't know what it was actually called. But anyway, he would get out there and plow. And as a little bitty boy, I would follow him down one row that he was making and back up the next. Or if he was, plowing to plant potatoes, he would go in the same spot several times so it would be nice and deep. But every time he took a step in that old red clay of North Alabama, it would leave his footprint in the sod, in the dirt, in the soil there in the garden. And as a little boy, I would walk right behind him, and I would try to put my feet exactly where his feet went. And of course, he was bigger than I was, so as a little fella, it was difficult for me to even do that. But as the years went on, I got bigger. It became easier to walk in his footsteps. And eventually, one day, he actually put me behind the plow. Actually, I was so small, I kind of had to hold it like this. But anyway, eventually, he had me plowing the garden, and I loved to plow, and I was doing what my father had done. Today we're going to talk about discipleship. We've entitled this lesson, You Were Made to Reach Out. In the acronym GRACE, last week we talked about genuine worship. This week we're talking about reaching out. The R stands for reaching out. That might sound like a strange choice of words to use for discipleship, because most of us, when we hear discipleship, if we have any education about biblical terminology at all, we think pupil or student or learner. And so it's easy to see ourselves in like a classroom situation with a professor, a teacher up there going over facts and explaining details and us getting an education, and eventually we're filled with this knowledge and we have finished discipleship. And I've chosen this phrase, reaching out, not only because I believe it's biblical, but I believe it emphasizes specifically the point of discipleship, and it runs against the grain of our tendency to listen and learn and to be hearers of the word and not doers of it. Listen to these words from John chapter 8, verse 30 through 32. It says, as he spake these words, this would have been Jesus speaking, many believed on him. Sounds like salvation, right? New birth experience. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt be saved. So that's it. They're not going to hell, they're going to heaven. End of story, right? No. He continues. Then said Jesus to those Jews which believed on him, quote, if you continue in my word, then ye are my disciples indeed. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. They believed, but he said, if you will continue in my word, then you'll be my disciples truly, and you'll know the truth. There's more for you to know, more for you to do. In Matthew chapter 4, verse 19, Jesus said, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. He didn't just say, listen to me. He said, follow me. And he didn't just say, follow me and you'll be a disciple. He said, follow me and I will make you a spiritual angler. He was a fisher of men. That's what we'll be looking at today. And he was training the men who followed him and the women to also be spiritual anglers, fishing for men, reaching out. I do not believe you can be a disciple just by looking up and looking within. I believe to be a disciple, you must be reaching out. So, 8 things today that we're going to go through and look at about discipleship. The first one, these disciples were found by Jesus. Jesus said to his disciples, "You haven't chosen me. I've chosen you." So they didn't come seeking for the master? No, he went seeking for them. Disciples are, first of all, found by Christ. He said things like, "Come and see." He said things like, "Follow me." He's the initiator. Disciples are found by Jesus. Number 2, the disciples forsook all. There are lots of things that are actually listed in the text. They forsook their nets and followed him. They left their ships. Matthew left the receipt, the desk where he was receiving taxes. Peter said they had forsaken all to follow him. Houses, family, safety, security. There were a lot of things that they forsook in order to follow Christ. And Jesus actually said, unless you forsake all and take up your cross, you cannot follow me. You can't be my disciple. You're not worthy of the kingdom. So they were found by him. They forsook all, and they followed him. I emphasize this fact because this is literally what they did. In other words, they said, "Hey, where are you staying?" He said, "Come and see." And they came and they stayed with him for the next 3.5 years. They walked with Jesus where he went. They talked with Jesus. They ate with Jesus. They slept where he was sleeping. He set the agenda. He led the way. And they followed. They were not in charge. They were not above their master. They were as their master and they were under their master, but they were following him. Number 4, the disciples fellowshiped with him. In worship, in service, they worshiped together, they served together. In suffering, the Apostle Paul said, "I want to know him." He already knew Christ. But he said, "I want to know him. Oh, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable unto his death." As they walked the same ground and had the same experiences, Jesus fellowshiped with the disciples, and they were in it together. Number 5, they focused on his teaching and his example. This is usually the only part we think of when we think of discipleship. They were listening. They were learning. They were emulating him. He was training them. They would say, "Explain this to us. What does this parable mean?" And they focused on him. Their eyes were focused on the teacher. That's part of discipleship. Also, they faithfully ministered with him, healing, helping, sometimes just hanging out like I did with my father, walking behind him in the garden, handing out the bread and the fish when Jesus fed the 5,000, holding to him, loving the people around him. They faithfully ministered with Jesus, and this is part of discipleship. What is required of stewards? That they be found faithful. You want to be a disciple? It requires faithfulness. And then they found others. We started this outline by looking at the fact that Jesus found the disciples, but they went and found others. They invited others to follow. There are many places in the New Testament where we see this. Certainly the disciples continued in and replicated the mission of Christ. We see this all over the place in the New Testament. Jesus was sent by the Father, and the Father sent his disciples out. Jesus said, "I am the light of the world." And then he said, "You are the light of the world." Jesus came to reconcile us with his Father, and he has given to us the ministry of reconciliation. So that's our mission. The same mission Jesus had. He found others, he found people and said, "Follow me," and they became his disciples. And we are to find others who will believe and say, "Follow us," even as we follow Christ, like Paul said, and they can be his disciples. Let me reassure you with this last point, though. They also failed him. Peter was the leader of the disciples after the resurrection. He was the leader of the disciples at Pentecost. He was the leader of the disciples in Jerusalem. And yet we know that when Jesus was being tried, Peter failed. He denied that he even knew Jesus. Discipleship does not mean perfection. If you become a true disciple of Jesus Christ, it doesn't mean you'll never do anything wrong again. As long as we're on this planet living in this flesh, we're going to fail. But a disciple will be looking up and will be looking out and will be significantly changed by their fellowship with Christ and their fellowship of Christ. Can you honestly say that you are a disciple? A believer, good. Going to heaven, great. A disciple, being disciplined by Christ, allowing him to train you in the way that you are to go. Eventually, the term Christian became used for the disciples. It meant like Christ. They followed Christ so closely that people with really a derogatory attitude called them little Christs. Take some time to look over these points and the passages that I've included here. And I've included some other questions as well for you to think about and some questions for you to look at over the next week as you prepare for lesson number 4.